They gave my sister the corner office with the view. They gave me the storage closet they converted into a workspace, the one that still smelled like cardboard boxes and old carpet cleaner. And somehow, that wasn't even the worst part of the day. The worst part came later, at the retirement party, when a woman I hadn't seen in 6 years walked through the door, stopped mid-stride, and stared at me like she was seeing a ghost. Then she leaned close and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "Stick with me tonight. I'll explain later." When she stood up to speak an hour later, every person in that room went completely still, and my father stopped smiling. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. It was a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of night that makes the Pacific Northwest feel like it's been carved out of low clouds and dark water. The event was held at a hotel banquet hall in Tacoma, Washington, the kind of venue that tries very hard to look elegant and almost gets there. Cream-colored tablecloths, small centerpieces of white chrysanthemums, little paper name cards in cursive. My father had worked for the same engineering firm for 31 years. Hargrove and Associates, civil infrastructure, bridges and drainage systems, and the kind of invisible work that keeps cities from flooding. His retirement party had been planned for months. My sister had organized it. I found out about it 3 weeks before it happened, when my mother texted me the date and address and added, almost as a footnote, that it would be nice if I could come. My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 32 years old. I've spent the last 8 years working as a structural engineer, the same field my father spent his career in, at a firm in Portland, 2 hours south of where I grew up. I have 2 patents filed under my name. I led the design team on a pedestrian bridge project that won a regional infrastructure award 2 years ago. I have never once been asked to explain any of that at a family dinner. My sister, Dana, is 36. She sells residential real estate in Tacoma. She is warm, social, effortlessly likable, and she has always been my parents' version of success. Not because she's achieved more, but because she stayed close. She calls every Sunday. She shows up to things. She fits into the frame of the life my parents imagined when they imagined their daughters. I left for college at 18 and never really came back. Not because I didn't love my family, but because I had a direction and I followed it, and the further I followed it, the more I seemed to disappear from the version of the family they described to other people. Dana bought her first house at 28, and my parents threw her a dinner party. I got promoted to senior engineer at 29, and my mother said, "That's nice, honey. Are you eating enough out there?" The distance between Portland and Tacoma is not very far in miles. In the language my family spoke, it might as well have been another country. I drove up the afternoon of the party. I wore a dark green dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, something that felt right for a professional event without being overdressed. I brought a card with a long handwritten note inside because I didn't know what else to offer a man who had never quite figured out how to talk to me. When I arrived at the hotel, Dana was already there. She had transformed the banquet hall into something genuinely lovely. Soft lighting, a slideshow of photos on a projector screen, a small string quartet in the corner playing quietly. She stood near the entrance greeting guests like she'd been born for it. Hair perfect, smile easy, wearing a cream blazer that matched the tablecloths almost exactly. "You made it," she said when she saw me, with the particular warmth of someone who is surprised but trying not to show it. "I said I was coming," I told her. "I know. I just wasn't sure if work would." "I'm here," I said. She squeezed my arm and turned back to the next arriving guest. I stood to the side and looked around the room. The photo slideshow on the projector cycled through images I recognized and many I didn't. There was my father at a job site in the early 90s, young and squinting into the sun. There was Dana at maybe 10 years old, sitting on his shoulders at a county fair. There was my parents' 25th anniversary dinner. There was a camping trip I didn't remember being invited on. The slideshow ran for about 4 minutes. I counted the photos. I appeared in 2 of them. I found my name card at a table near the back left corner, wedged between a couple I'd never met who turned out to be neighbors from my parents' street, and a man named Gerald who had worked in the firm's accounting department for about 6 months in 2009. I looked at the table, then at the room, then back at the table. The front tables were filled with my father's longtime colleagues, his project managers, his former supervisors, people who had worked alongside him for decades. Dana sat at the head table with my parents. There was no card with my name anywhere near them. I sat down. The neighbors were kind. Gerald asked politely what I did for work, and when I told him, he said, "Oh, so like your dad," and then turned to the neighbor couple and began talking about their street's new HOA regulations. I ordered a sparkling water and watched the room fill up. My father arrived to a burst of applause. He looked genuinely moved, which made something tighten in my chest because I loved him, complicated and quietly and from a distance, but I did. He was a good man. He just had a particular blind spot shaped exactly like me. I watched him work the room. He stopped at every table, shaking hands, laughing, accepting small gifts and cards. When he reached my table, he hugged me briefly. "Glad you made it, sweetheart." Then he turned to Gerald and spent 4 minutes talking about a drainage project from 2003 they had apparently both worked on. When he moved away, I straightened my napkin in my lap and reminded myself I was here for him, not for me. The cocktail hour stretched into dinner, the string quartet played. People laughed and toasted with glasses of wine. Dana floated from table to table, refreshing conversations, making sure everyone felt included. She was genuinely good at this. I didn't resent her for it. I just felt the particular ache of watching someone belong in a room you have always been slightly outside of. I was on my second sparkling water when the door at the far end of the hall opened, and a woman walked in, late, slightly windswept, still wearing her coat. She scanned the room with quick professional eyes, and then her gaze landed on me and she stopped. I recognized her in the same moment she recognized me. Dr. Margaret O.C. She had been the chair of civil engineering at the University of Washington when I was a student there. More than that, she had been my thesis advisor, the person who looked at my undergraduate research and told me I had a real perspective, not just competence. She had written the recommendation letters that opened every door I walked through in the first 3 years of my career. She had since left academia and become the director of infrastructure development at a federal agency overseeing Pacific Northwest transportation projects. She was, to put it plainly, one of the most respected people in my professional field. I had not seen her since a conference in Seattle nearly 6 years ago. She crossed the room with a certainty that made people instinctively step aside, still in her coat, and stopped in front of my table. "Claire Whitfield," she said. Not a question, a statement, the way someone speaks when they cannot quite believe what they're seeing. "Dr. O.C., I said, half rising from my chair on instinct. Her eyes moved from my face to the table number, then to the room, then back to me. She had the particular still expression of someone who is processing something and deciding very carefully how to respond to it. "Why are you sitting back here?" she asked. I opened my mouth. Closed it. "It's just where I was seated," I finally said. "It's fine." "It is not fine," she said, and sat down in the empty chair next to me as if she had been planning to sit there all along. She finally took her coat off and folded it over the back of her chair. "Stick with me tonight," she said quietly. "I'll explain later." I didn't know what that meant. But there was something about Dr. Margaret O.C. that made you trust her intentions before she finished stating them. She had that quality. You felt it when she walked into a room. I had felt it the first time she sat across from me in her office hours and told me to stop apologizing for my own ideas. The dinner continued. Dr. O.C. was immediately recognized by several of my father's colleagues, who made their way to our table with expressions of barely concealed awe. She was gracious and warm and introduced me each time, not as Thomas Whitfield's daughter, but by my name and my firm and the bridge project, which she referenced in specific technical detail that made the colleagues lean forward with interest. I watched their expressions shift as they recalibrated who they were talking to. At our own table, I was invisible. In those moments, I was not. My father watched from the front of the room with an expression I couldn't fully read from that distance. He knew who Dr. O.C. was. He'd heard me mention her name during my undergraduate years. Whether he connected her reputation to my career, I wasn't sure. As the dinner plates were cleared and the room settled into that easy post-meal warmth, Dr. O.C. leaned toward me slightly. "That bridge project," she said. "The East Side pedestrian span, yes? I was on the review panel that recommended it for the regional award. I read every page of your design documentation." She paused. "You didn't know that?" I shook my head. "Your load distribution approach was unconventional," she said. "Half the panel didn't understand it immediately." I spent 20 minutes explaining why it was the right call. A small, precise smile. "You would have won regardless, but I wanted you to know." My throat tightened unexpectedly. I took a sip of water. "You've done serious work," she said simply. "Work that matters. Work that will be standing in 50 years. I didn't trust myself to answer that, so I nodded and looked down at the tablecloth for a moment. Then I heard the gentle tap of a microphone being tested. The program had begun. My father's former supervisor spoke first, a tall man with white hair who told a warm story about a flooded underpass in 1998 and my father's solution that saved the city 6 months of delays. Colleagues laughed and nodded. My father looked like a man finally hearing things he'd needed to hear. Then Dana stood up, graceful and prepared, and gave a speech that was genuinely beautiful. She talked about growing up watching their father leave for job sites before sunrise. She talked about the blueprints he spread on the kitchen table. She talked about how she'd always known their father was building something that would outlast him, even if she didn't always understand the technical details. People reached for their napkins. My father's eyes went bright. She sat down to extended applause. There was a natural pause in the program. The MC, a younger colleague of my father's, began shuffling his notes for the closing remarks, and then Dr. O.C. pushed back her chair. She did it quietly, without announcement. She simply stood, and something about the way she stood made the room notice. The murmur of conversation softened. The MC looked up in surprise. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, in a voice that carried without effort. "I'll keep this brief." The room settled completely. My palms flattened against my thighs beneath the table. "My name is Margaret Osei. I'm the Director of Infrastructure Development at the Federal Office of Pacific Northwest Transportation. Some of you in this room know that name. Most of you know Thomas Whitfield, whose career we are here to celebrate tonight, and whose contributions to this region's civil infrastructure are genuinely significant." She paused. "But I would like to take 60 seconds to acknowledge someone else in this room." I felt the heat rise in my face before she said my name. "Claire Whitfield." Heads turned. The way heads always turn when a name is called in a quiet room, quickly, reflexively. My father's head turned. Dana's turned more slowly. My mother's hand stopped moving above her champagne glass. Claire was my student at the University of Washington 15 years ago. Dr. O.C. continued, steady and unhurried. She was, without qualification, one of the most technically gifted students I advised in 20 years of teaching. She did not coast on that gift. She worked with a discipline and a rigor that I have rarely seen matched. The room was very still. She is now a senior structural engineer at Meridian Bridge Group in Portland, where she led the design of the East Side pedestrian span, which received the 2022 Pacific Northwest Infrastructure Excellence Award. She holds 2 patents. She has contributed to projects that people cross every day without knowing her name. A brief pause. That is the nature of engineering. But I know her name, and I think the people in this room should too. Her eyes found mine across the room. My throat ached. "I also want to say one more thing," she added, and her voice stayed measured, careful, not unkind. "I arrived tonight and found Claire seated in the back corner of this room, among guests who had no particular connection to this family or this career." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I have spent my life in rooms where credit is assigned unevenly. I have learned to say something when I see it, so I am saying something." She raised her glass. "To Claire Whitfield, who builds things that last." A silence of perhaps 2 seconds. Then someone began to clap. And then several people. And then the room. A few people near the front stood. My father did not stand. He sat very still, looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in my adult life. I could not name it immediately. Then I could not name it immediately. Then I could. It was the expression of a man encountering a fact he should already have known. Dr. Osei sat back down beside me. "I hope that was all right," she said in a much quieter voice. "I don't know yet," I managed. "That's honest," she said, and refilled my water glass. The program concluded shortly after. The MC delivered his remarks, the string quartet played a final piece, and the room began the slow, gentle dissolution of a party ending. Conversations resumed. My father stood near the front, accepting final congratulations. I stayed at my table. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find my way to him or wait for him to find his way to me. I had waited for that most of my life. I was tired of waiting and also, somehow, not ready to stop. It was my mother who came first. She appeared at the edge of my table looking slightly uncertain, which was unusual. My mother was not an uncertain woman in public. She managed social situations with the calm efficiency of someone who had been practicing for decades. But she stood at the corner of my table with her hands folded in front of her and said, "Dr. Osei seems to think very highly of you." "She was my advisor," I said. "I didn't know she was going to be here tonight." "Neither did I." My mother looked toward the front of the room, then back at me. "You should have been at the family table," she said, and the way she said it made clear she was not entirely sure whose fault that was, which meant she suspected it might partly be hers. "It's okay," I said. "It isn't, really," she said quietly. She reached out and touched my hand briefly, a small gesture, not theatrical, which made it mean more. Then she went back toward the front of the room. My father came 20 minutes later when most guests had begun to leave. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down with the careful movement of a man in his early 60s who had spent 30 years on job sites and was starting to feel it. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at me. "I knew Margaret Osei's name," he said. "I knew she was important in the field. I didn't know you had worked with her. I told you about her when I was an undergrad," I said. "She was my thesis advisor." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't remember that." It should have stung more than it did. Maybe I'd simply expected it for too long to be surprised by it anymore. "Dad," I said, "I don't need you to have memorized everything. I just needed you to have paid attention sometimes." He exhaled. Not defensively, more like a man setting something heavy down after carrying it a long way without knowing he was carrying it. "I thought you were fine," he said. "You always seemed fine. You went off and you built your career and you didn't seem to need." He stopped. "Dana needed more from us. She went through her divorce and the years before that, and she was nearby and she needed us to show up. And you never asked us to show up." "I stopped asking," I said carefully, because the answer was always kind of quiet. He looked at me for a long moment. "That's fair." We sat with that for a while. The string quartet was packing up their instruments. A server moved through the room collecting champagne glasses. Somewhere near the door, I could hear Dana laughing with the last group of departing guests. "The bridge," my father said finally. "The one she mentioned. The award. The East Side pedestrian span. I want to see it." I looked at him. "It's in Portland." "I know where Portland is, Claire." Something almost like a smile in his voice. "I spent 30 years building infrastructure. I'd like to see what my daughter built." The tightness in my chest shifted into something else. Something that didn't have a clean name but felt like the first breath after a long time of breathing carefully. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he agreed. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his for a moment. Brief and a little awkward. The gesture of a man not practiced in this, but doing it anyway. Then he stood and went to find my mother. I sat alone at the table for a few more minutes. The hall was nearly empty now. Just the catering staff folding tablecloths, the last guests filtering out. the chrysanthemum centerpieces beginning to lean slightly in the way flowers do at the end of a long night. Dr. Osei appeared beside me again, coat back on. "I'm heading out," she said. "Early flight." "Thank you," I said. "For tonight?" "I'm not sure it was necessary." "It was necessary," she said simply. "You've been letting rooms underestimate you since I met you. That is a habit worth breaking." She tilted her head slightly. "You broke it tonight, even if someone else did the breaking. Let that mean something." She said goodnight and walked toward the exit, and I watched her go. And I thought about the way certain people enter your life and recalibrate your sense of what is possible, not by changing what you are, but by refusing to pretend it's less than it is. I drove back to Portland late that night, the highway dark and wet, the city lights coming up gradually through the rain. I thought about my father's hands folded on the table. I thought about my mother touching my hand without quite knowing she was going to. I thought about the way the room had turned when my name was called and how it had felt like the first time my name had been called in that room in a very long time. Things didn't change overnight. They rarely do. My father drove to Portland 6 weeks later, on a gray Saturday in December. I walked him across the East Side Bridge in the cold morning air, explaining the design decisions, the load calculations, the way the deck curves slightly to follow the natural arc of the riverbank. He listened with the focused attention of a man who understood what he was hearing. He asked specific questions. Good questions. The kind that told me he had been reading about it before he came. At the midpoint of the bridge, he leaned on the railing and looked down at the water for a while. "It's a good bridge," he said finally. Coming from an engineer with 31 years in the field, standing on the bridge his daughter designed, those 4 words held everything. We had dinner afterward at a small restaurant near my apartment, and we talked for 3 hours, longer than we had talked in years, about the work, about the years in between, about the ways we had each misread the distance between us. He had thought my self-sufficiency meant I didn't need him. I had thought his silence meant he wasn't interested. We had spent 15 years confirming what the other expected instead of asking what was actually true. It was clumsy and uneven and quietly healing. Dana called me the week after the party, unexpectedly, and said she was sorry about the seating chart. She said she hadn't thought much about it when she made it, and that was the part she felt worst about, not a decision, but an absence of one. I told her I understood. I did understand. Being overlooked and being erased aren't the same thing. And my sister had never meant to erase me. She had just been so occupied with the center of the frame that she hadn't noticed where I was standing. We had lunch together the next time I came up to Tacoma. It was ordinary and warm, and we talked about her kids and my projects, and a TV show we had both been watching, and nothing that happened was dramatic or resolved. We were just 2 sisters having lunch, which was more than we had been in a long time. Dr. Osei and I kept in touch. She connected me with a federal review panel working on new bridge safety standards the following spring, and I spent 4 months contributing technical input to a document that would eventually shape infrastructure guidelines across 6 states. The work was quiet and technical and largely invisible to anyone outside the field. It was exactly the kind of work I had always done. But I stopped apologizing for its invisibility. I started just doing it and letting it be what it was. My father sent me a photo the following summer. He had gone back to the East Side Bridge on his own, apparently, during a trip to Portland to visit some old colleagues. He had taken the photo from the midpoint looking east, the river catching the late afternoon light below. He texted it to me with no message, just the photo. I looked at it for a long time. Then I texted back, "I'm glad you went back." He replied, "I wanted to see it again." That was enough, more than enough actually. When you've spent years measuring love in its absence, you become very good at recognizing it in small, quiet forms. The retirement party became the kind of family story that gets referenced sideways, never quite directly, the night that shifted something. My mother sometimes mentions Dr. Osei with a careful, considered respect, the way people mention someone who told them a truth they needed and didn't fully ask for. My father started calling me on Saturday mornings, not always with a reason, which was its own kind of reason. I still live in Portland. I still build things. I am still, most of the time, unknown in rooms where my work is present, which is the nature of infrastructure, of any work that holds things up without announcing itself. But I stopped sitting at the back table, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly stopped accepting the coordinates that other people assigned to me when they hadn't done the math. I started taking up the space my work had earned, not because someone fought for me, though someone did, but because watching someone fight for you when you're 32 years old and have earned every credential in the room teaches you something you can't unlearn. You do not have to wait for a person with more authority than you to confirm that you belong somewhere. But if that person shows up and says the thing plainly, you can let it mean something. You can let it be the moment you stop doubting what you already knew. I built a bridge. People cross it every day. Some of them look at the water, some of them look at their phones, some of them look at the way the deck curves slightly to follow the bank, and maybe, for a second, wonder how it got that way. I know how it got that way. That's enough. If something in this story reached you, if you felt overlooked in rooms where you've already done the work, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you'd like more stories about resilience and the people who build things quietly, I hope you'll stay.